In 2002, Stephen Davis was living in the Philippines with his wife and 2 children. He owned his own computer programming business, and his income meant that he could live a life of luxury in the island nation. At least that's how things seemed on the outside. But that year, a tragic event would reveal the cracks in a relationship that already had questionable beginnings. This is Monsters. Stephen Alston Davis was born on March 27, 1970 to Joe and Margaret Davis. He lived on the east coast of England and had 2 younger sisters, Catherine and Lucy. When he was 14 years old, his father was in a motorcycle accident that left him with brain damage. When Joe died 2 years later, Stephen stepped up and did what he could to help his mother. A few years later, Margaret started dating a man named Alan, who was welcomed by the 3 siblings. Stephen became good with computers and after graduating college started working as a software developer. When he was 21, he was offered a job in Hong Kong. There he lived in a small apartment and worked on the computer systems at a newly built airport. Stephen made friends with his coworkers, and on weekends they would take the short trip to the Philippines to have some fun. That was where Stephen would end up meeting Evelyn Bohol. Now, as you're about to find out, this case is not as black and white as some other cases I've covered. I do my best to respect the victims in these stories, but just because they're victims doesn't mean they didn't also do bad things. Of course, they aren't here to defend themselves, so we can't know the story 100%. But in this case, Stephen does act in a way that I believe is predatory. At the same time, just because the victim isn't the greatest person doesn't mean the monster in the story isn't still a monster. I don't believe it's anyone's right to be judge, jury, and executioner alone. There are stories of people who have gone out, hunted down predators, and killed them, and I get it. I'd be lying if I didn't say I viewed them as a little less monstery than other killers. When I named this show, the word monster wasn't supposed to mean the person was completely unredeemable. It was supposed to represent the person that took someone away from their loved ones. A boogeyman, the monster under their bed, so to speak. So when I tell the story of a monster, I'm just identifying whoever did something horrible to someone else. At some point, I would like to do a season where it's the monster who gets killed. But for now, this story includes a monster and a victim, and some of the actions of the victim might be considered questionable. It's a story I found interesting because of that aspect, and hopefully you also find it interesting. Evelyn Bohol was raised in Duram Samar, a small impoverished island on the eastern side of the Philippines. It's only accessible by boat, and there's no electricity, running water, or sewer system. Her mother described her as a good girl when she was young, helping out around the house. When she was 13 years old, she left home and traveled to Angeles, which is considered the sex capital of the Philippines. Stephen had become interested in flying in his early 20s, so he joined a flying club in Angeles, which is only a couple hours away from Hong Kong. Evelyn was 15 years old when she met Stephen, who was already 25. Stephen had gone to the bar where she worked, and they spent the evening together. He returned to the bar the next day and ended up paying the equivalent of £500 to release her from her work contract. There aren't any details about their sexual relationship, as most accounts of the story seem to gloss over it completely. In the book For the Love of My Son, which was written by Stephen's mother Margaret Davis, she obviously doesn't mention Evelyn's age at all. She just says that he was smitten with her and he would send pictures home all the time. Most of the articles and documentaries I've seen mention her age, but don't seem to want to question Stephen, likely because he's the victim. I found one source that said Evelyn used the ID of her older sister to trick Stephen into believing she was older. But if that's true, do I think Stephen was naive enough to not know how those establishments worked? It's said that Stephen and his friends spent a lot of time in Angeles and enjoyed hanging out at the bars in the area, an area known as the sex capital of the Philippines, an area known for underage sex workers. The other problem I have is that Stephen ultimately bought a person. He found a very young-looking girl and flat out purchased her from the bar. It's definitely easy to view Stephen's behavior as predatory. That said, as the victim who is no longer here to defend himself, I can only speculate about what he knew and what his intentions were. The couple ended up getting married in 1997 when Evelyn was 17 years old. Stephen was 27. In one interview, Margaret says she wasn't happy that Stephen had married a sex worker, but claimed that you had to be there to understand the situation. It really feels like she does whatever she can to live in denial of the truth about the relationship. In her book, she claimed, quote, "I must admit, when I met her, I remember thinking that she wasn't quite the sort of girl I'd have chosen for him. She was very young and totally uneducated, but I was won over like him by her politeness, her ready smile, and her respectful attitude. And so beautiful." It seemed that even after meeting the teenager, his parents accepted the relationship. According to Margaret, Stephen said, quote, "I'm rescuing her, Mom." At the end of the day, though, it's not unreasonable to think Stephen may have actually been manipulated, at least to some degree, by Evelyn. Meeting a rich Western man was what Evelyn was hoping for. As a child, well, a younger child, she would tell her mother that she wanted to become a bar lady and marry a really wealthy blonde man. By the standards in the Philippines, Stephen definitely fit that description. He made good money working with computers, and he also put in long hours, which increased that income. It's a common routine for young girls in the Philippines to go to work at the bars in order to meet a wealthy Westerner who they can marry, and then that man would end up taking care of their entire family. The cost of living in the Philippines is so low that even someone who makes a decent living but isn't considered rich in the US or the UK can still seem extremely wealthy there. It wasn't long before Stephen and Evelyn had their first child together, a daughter named Jessica. By then, Stephen had moved to Angeles, and he and a colleague, Mike Dunn, started their own computer programming business in Manila. Stephen and Mike lived in a condo near the city, and Stephen would return to Angeles on the weekends. After a few years, they welcomed a son named Joshua. Even though Stephen was away during the weekdays, Evelyn didn't have a tough job taking care of the house and the kids. He hired housekeepers to clean and even help with the children. He paid for her family to build the only brick house on the island, and he paid for a fishing boat. Evelyn's family would say that the money went to her head. She began acting better than others because of her lifestyle. Stephen's family noticed that Evelyn didn't seem to reciprocate his love. When they would visit, they would notice that she would pull away when Stephen tried to hold her hand and that she remained emotionally distant. Of course, some could claim that it was because she didn't love him. She was a purchased wife who was willing to go with anyone who had the means of getting her out of the bar. She probably only made Stephen feel like she was in love with him in order to take advantage of him. Outside of that, though, they eventually noticed that she was always away from the group texting, or sometimes they could even hear her giggling. They assumed that she was having an affair, and Evelyn would eventually admit that to her sister Gina. Evelyn said she was dating a local man named Arnold Adore. Arnold worked as a security guard and made about £1,000 a year. That was the same amount of money Stephen gave Evelyn to spend each month. Evelyn claims that she never had an affair and never confessed to her sister. Still, there were other problems, most notably when Stephen took their daughter to the private nursery school he was paying for and learned that she had never been enrolled. Evelyn had just kept the money that was supposed to be for tuition. Then he found out that she had pawned her wedding ring. Stephen initially hid from the problems. He would tell Evelyn he was going out of town on business and would stay at the condo partying with his friends and local girls. He also began going to the bars and hiring sex workers. Eventually, he decided he wanted to save his marriage and told Evelyn that she needed to return the money she took and either get a job or enroll in college. When she didn't do any of those things, he threatened to divorce her. Evelyn was then faced with the possibility of having to return to work as a sex worker. Her privileged life was at risk and she needed to find a way to save it. On July 17, 2002, Stephen and Mike worked late at their office and then returned to the condo at about 10:45 p.m. Stephen went to sleep soon after, but Mike had to pick up his fiancée, Jennifer Castillo, from the airport at 11:30 p.m. They returned to the condo at about 1 a.m. and went to sleep. About an hour later, they heard movement outside of their door, and when they looked up, they saw a light shining from underneath. Then, 3 men entered the room and pointed a gun at Mike. They asked if he was Stephen, and when Mike said no, they locked Jennifer in the bathroom and took Mike's wallet, keys, and cell phone. Then they went into Stephen's room where one of the men fired 4 shots into the sleeping man's body. After the men fled, Mike went into the other bedroom where he attempted to perform CPR on his colleague, but it was no use. Stephen was dead. After the police questioned him and he was released, Mike spent 4 hours trying to contact Evelyn before she finally answered. He said that when he finally met up with her at 10 a.m., she showed no signs of grief at the death of her husband. It was Mike who would go on to inform Margaret and Alan of Stephen's death. Evelyn made no attempt to contact them. Once Margaret and Alan were in the Philippines, they didn't get much help from the police until they paid to have the investigation moved forward. Then Margaret hired a private investigator to watch Evelyn, and he recorded 2 men going to her house a number of times. When she gave that information to the police, that led them to the arrest of her boyfriend Arnold Adore and his friend Alexander Tagami. Mike was able to identify them as having been 2 of the 3 men in his condo on the night of the murder. While that was going on, authorities were warning Margaret and Alan that they were in danger staying in the Philippines. Associates of the accused knew who they were and might come after them. Margaret didn't want to leave without her grandchildren, though. She had obtained passports for them and she was able to get Jessica, but Evelyn wouldn't tell them where Joshua was. In the end, they returned to England with Jessica and Stephen's ashes. When they learned that the boy was living with Evelyn's parents, she offered them £200 to hand him over. They agreed. It took 2 more years to finally uncover evidence that Evelyn was involved in Stephen's murder. It was Evelyn's own family that provided them with the identity of the 3rd man who had been involved. It was her own brother-in-law, Robin Butas. When the police started asking questions about Stephen's murder, Robin fled the area, but family members told the police where he was. After he was arrested, he confessed to being involved and he admitted that it was Evelyn who had asked Arnold and Alexander to commit the murder. He claimed she asked him to go along at the last minute just in case. He said that she was with them when they drove to Stephen's condo and she waited in the car while the 3 went in and killed her husband. He said that Arnold had pulled the trigger. Investigators learned that Evelyn had been telling people that Stephen was a millionaire and if he died, she would get all of his money. It's likely she believed that, as their lifestyle to her would have seemed like one that was only attainable by being that wealthy. In return for testifying against Arnold and Alexander, Robin was released, but the other 2 were convicted of the murder and given life sentences. In February of 2004, Evelyn was arrested and charged with the murder of Stephen. Of course, she denied any involvement, but there was more evidence beside the word of her brother-in-law. It turned out that none of the 3 men knew exactly where Stephen's condo was. They hadn't known where they were going on the evening of the murder, and Evelyn gave them directions as they drove there. She also provided them with a key to get into the apartment, which was why there was no sign of forced entry. Evelyn claimed that she was home all night, but her neighbor reported seeing her come home in the early morning hours the following morning. The defense didn't have a single witness to testify in support of her. Her own family believed she was involved in the murder and had turned their backs on her. On November 25, 2004, Evelyn Bohol was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. With Evelyn in prison, Stephen's 2 children remain in England with Margaret and Alan. Margaret was given a chance to talk to Evelyn after the trial, and she continued to deny any involvement in the murder, and she maintained that she was not having an affair. She broke down and started crying, but there were no tears. Like I said, this is a complicated case, and it's a fine line to talk about a victim who might have also done something bad themselves. I don't want to cause any additional suffering to the victim's loved ones, but meeting and falling in love with a 15-year-old is not acceptable behavior. Even if you want to claim he didn't know her real age, he met her because he frequented establishments that provide underage sex workers in a place that's known around the world for being a place you go for underage sex workers. I feel like that was shrugged off in all of the accounts of this case I found, and I think that's a huge disservice to all of the people who are suffering in that industry. Shrugging it off as, it's just the culture there, or making it seem like child sexual assault is not a big deal because this guy ended up murdered is wrong. Now, at the same time, it wasn't right for Evelyn to murder him. It seems like her motive was strictly money, but otherwise it shouldn't be up to individuals to decide who gets executed and for what reason, outside of self-defense, which this clearly was not. If that becomes okay, then our world will not last long. That said, I leave you to decide who, in this case, is the monster. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.